which of the Gospels came first? It's probably one of the Synoptic Gospels. All the church fathers agree that John came last. The Greek for John is very polished, as if it happened later when the church had grown and there was some guys who were really good at helping John put that together. But the Synoptic Gospels came first. But which of them was first? The scholars overwhelmingly say Mark was first and Luke and Matthew borrowed from Mark. And that is why they share a lot of common material. There's clearly borrowing going on. So the question is, who borrowed from who? And the scholarly consensus is Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark. Church tradition, however, says that Matthew was written first, but it was not written in Greek. It was written in the Hebrew dialect is the original quote. It's a little mysterious. Is that Hebrew? Is that Aramaic? Is that something else? But it was written in a non-Greek language first, is the testimony of the church fathers. And I want to go into that because I think the tradition is right and the majority of scholarship is wrong. But who am I to even offer an opinion on such a question? Absolutely nobody. There's only two reasons why I think I should even bother to offer an opinion that contradicts the scholars on this issue, because it's not my specialty. I think I've been shown by supernatural revelation the truth about what early Genesis is saying. By supernatural revelation, I'm saying that I've read the same text I've been reading all my life, and suddenly I saw it differently. And I kept going, and it kept happening. And I started writing it down. I didn't know what I was going to say about the flood when I started writing about Adam. By the time I got to chapter 6, 7, and 8, what I wrote down was totally different than what I thought when I started writing about chapters 1, 2, and 3. And so, I've basically been, for these past 7 years, I've been teaching the Christ-centered model for early Genesis. And the institutional churches, they will be the last to get it. They have their shtick, they have their thing they're defending. The evangelical churches don't really have a lot of doctrine, but they're not interested in doctrine. So they're not picking it up either. And I thought, well, this is too great for me. Some other people need to pick it up and run with it. But they didn't. And I got shown some more things. I got shown something about the end of Revelation, how it connects to early Genesis, things about the Trinity, things about Christ in the Old Testament, connecting the in human history, the beginnings of religion and faith to things that are in Genesis, like what the Akkadians were doing, what the Sumerians were doing. All of that was extra. And so one thing that makes me think that I should bother offering an opinion about a scenario in which Matthew comes first and the mainstream scholars are wrong, one reason is that God has just kept showing me things. And I only wanted it to be early Genesis. I only thought it would be early Genesis. Early Genesis alone is too great for me. I need help. I need other people that are in the business. I am not. I have a secular vocation. I have a family that deserves my time and attention. But they don't want to, and I can understand why, although a part of me, I'm disappointed every time. Every time I run to a Christian and I share a Christ-centered view of the text of Genesis with them and they don't want to hear it, I'm disappointed that Christians, and I should, by this time I should not be, but I'm disappointed at how resistant Christian people and institutions are to considering a Christ-centered theology for early Genesis. And by now I should not be, but it still disappoints me every time. Maybe God's just going to keep showing me stuff until someone else gets it. I don't know. I hope that it changes today and the church starts picking it up, evangelical Christians start picking it up, congregational or more traditional denominations start reconsidering. But so far, they have not, and so far, the answer has been, okay, here's something else that's true. Eventually, they're going to start realizing, wait a minute, this makes sense, that makes sense, the other makes sense. He's right about Christ is the center of early Genesis. Even in early Genesis, it's about him. So that's one of the reasons that gives me confidence that even though I have no background for this, I have no training for this, maybe I can be right about this too. The second reason that I think I can be right about this, even though, like I said, I don't have any special training, I don't have any credentials, but the scholarship, the state of scholarship today, I'm calling the scholars to repentance, that they start using their gifts to do good instead of evil. And what evil is using their gifts to sit around and think of ways to undermine the authority of Scripture and the authority of the early church witnesses. That's all they do. They sit around and how can we show, the early witnesses say this, how can we show that something else is true? How can we show that this text really is not credible and not anything you should take seriously for spiritual guidance today? And maybe they don't say it in quite that blunt of terms, but that is the effect of what they do. And because of that, you get this, the truth is somewhere on this spectrum. And on the one end, it's the scriptures do make sense. They are from a supernatural source. They are divinely inspired. And the church fathers are witnesses to that. And most of them got it right most of the time. And on the other end of the extreme it's just another ancient text. We can look at it and analyze it just like another ancient text. There's nothing supernatural in it that makes us need to change that calculus or consideration. And the church fathers, we're going to assume, unless we can see it, unless we have the evidence, we're going to assume they didn't know what they were talking about. We're coming along 1900 years later, and you got to prove it to our satisfaction before we believe it. We're not just going to take their word for anything. In fact, we're going to think of elaborate ways to show that they could be wrong instead of right. And so if you look at it as sort of an investment advice, are we long on bonds? Are we short on bonds? That sort of thing. All the bets are on one end. And in finance, when all the bets are on one end, guess where the money is often made? It's on the other end that's underappreciated. When everybody's on this end. And I think that's true. I think the first few scholars who break the mold, who have the guts, who have the integrity, who have the courage to start saying, I'm going to start trying to find reasons why the tablet theory makes sense, for example, as an explanation for Genesis. I'm going to start looking and seeing why church tradition regarding Matthew being the first book or first of the Gospels makes sense. The first one that does that, I think it'd be like a life form going into a new niche that's been unexploited. They're going to have a big explosion in their population. It's going to be rich because there's no competition over there. All the other scholars, it's true, the dirty money that is funding a lot of theology right now is over here on the other end, and that's why they're over there on that end. But it's getting to be a crowded pool over there, and there's a lot of truth over here that's going unrecognized. So here's what church tradition says, that Matthew came first, and the earliest record of this was Eusebius, and he was quoting Papias, and Papias was quoting the Apostle John. So this is the third generation of the church. Papias was a close disciple of John, and Eusebius of him. And so here's what they say that John said. Therefore Matthew set in order the logia, the divine oracles, in a Hebrew dialect, and each interpreted them as he was able. That's a Greek guy saying this. I want you to hold on to that statement, that not only did Matthew set in order the divine oracles of Jesus in a Hebrew dialect, and again, there's some dispute as to what that means, but maybe it just means the Hebrew language. Maybe it means Aramaic as a dialect of Hebrew or something close to Hebrew, which is the language they spoke in the day. And then and each interpreted them as he was able. And after that point, there were other early church fathers that also testified that Matthew came first. I think Jerome in the 3rd century went to some church on Asia Minor and found an early copy of Matthew. And he said, it's there. Go look at it. He found the early copy of Matthew that was in the other language. It was not in Greek. And the fact is that the early church quoted Matthew far more than they quoted Mark. It was like Matthew was the source they looked to for the gospel. And you would think if Peter was indeed the first pope, Mark, the tradition says that Mark was almost like the personal assistant of Peter. And so that Mark was comprised of Mark listening to Peter and writing down what stories Peter said about Jesus. And so that would be very early. That would be first generation. But Matthew was a disciple of Jesus, writing himself, presumably when he was still young enough to see and write and all that. So you would think both of these would be very early. Now, the nature of Mark is, and we're going to look at that on the next screen, the nature of Mark is a little different from the others. It has been called a passion narrative with a long introduction, because first of all, Mark is very small compared to the other Gospels, and after about the first 7 or 8 chapters, it starts switching to the passion of the Christ, to the arrest, to the trial, to the crucifixion. So really, about half of it has to do with the passion, and the other problem with Mark is the ending of Mark is highly controversial. The 2 earliest copies of Mark we have end at verse 8 of chapter 16. Now, it goes through to verse 20 in our Bibles, most of our Bibles. So you think, well, the earliest copies don't have it. It sounds like it was added later. And it does sound like an ending was added later. And the ending reads in very different language than the rest of Mark. But we do have some early church fathers quoting from the end of Mark, so we know that this other ending was out there early. And in the 2 earliest copies of Mark that do not have the ending, they have a blank space, as if maybe in that blank space is not found in the other Gospels. So it's like we should leave some room here in case we want to put this ending in. We're not sure if we want to do it or not, and they chose not to on the 2 earliest copies. So those verses of Mark are controversial. You wonder if it really came from Mark. And perhaps it didn't come from Mark. And so we should view doctrines drawn from those verses with caution. But where does Mark end? Mark ends with the angels telling the women, Jesus is not here. He's risen. And so it leaves you on a cliffhanger. If you just take Mark at the sort of the conservative ending would be to not include verses 9 through 20 in the ending. But when you do that, it leaves you with a cliffhanger. So Mark is very strange. It doesn't dwell very much on the teachings of Jesus. It has a long introduction, and then it starts the Passion Week and the crucifixion, and it ends with this cliffhanger. The women go to the tomb. They see there's nothing there, and an angel tells them, no, he's not here. He's risen. But it doesn't report the resurrection, or Jesus doesn't have Jesus resurrected and coming and talking to his disciples at that point in the text. So what is going on here? Now, again, they are making some we could call it speculation, or we could call it logical inferences. But I've done a little writing. I've studied a little bit about how art is done in movies and books and plays and all that. And to me, it looks like Mark was meant to be part 1 of a work that would basically do the same thing that Luke did. Luke actually did what Mark and Peter wanted to start. Luke wrote a gospel, and then he wrote the Acts of the Apostles. And it looks to me like that is what Peter and Mark wanted to do. But maybe Peter got crucified, and they never got to write Act 2. Maybe that was the case, and Mark just took what he had and put it out there. and it was sort of an unfinished work because it was always meant to be Act 1 in a or Volume 1 in a 2-volume book. And so the next volume was going to pick up with the resurrected Jesus appearing to his disciples, telling them to do some things, and then describing what they did, kind of like Acts does. They just Mark ended in a slightly different place from Luke, and perhaps Peter got crucified before they could finish the story. But he put it out there anyway. So that is my inference, and that is my best speculation of why Mark is odd the way it is. It wasn't meant to be a finished story. It was meant to be part 1 of a 2-volume work that never got finished, but they put it out there anyway. So all the knuckleheads and the scholars trying to say, well, see, this proves the early church, they want Mark to be first because it doesn't ever have Jesus in his resurrected state appearing to the disciples if you chop off verses 9 through 20. So that's if 9 through 20 is not original to the text, and if Mark, if it wasn't meant to simply be the first volume of a 2-volume set like Luke did with Luke and Acts, then they can make the case, oh, see, the views of Jesus changed. And they're still wrong because it ends with the angel saying, he's not here, he's risen again. They're still wrong. But in order for their, so they say, well, if Mark came first, that's true. And I'm going to show you, I don't think Mark came first. I'm going to show you why. All right, take a look at this diagram, which I borrowed, and forgive me, I can't remember where I borrowed it from, but then I tweaked it a little bit to help it look a little better. But this is the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels. And the size of the circles represents the size of the material. And then the same colors represent shared material between the two. Now notice that Mark is smaller than the others because I said it's a much shorter work than the others. And that 76% of Mark can also be found in Matthew. And that same amount of material, that 76% of Mark, is only 46% of Matthew because Matthew is bigger. It's only 41% of Luke because Luke is slightly bigger than Matthew even. And Matthew and Mark, and that purple area, by the way, is stuff that's shared by all 3 Gospels. Material shared by all 3 Gospels. Mark, Matthew, Luke. Sometimes the exact same phrasings. And that's unusual in Greek because in Greek, there are many ways to say the same thing. You can take a simple sentence, and there's 8 different ways to write it in Greek. All of them are correct. So the translator could have written that sentence any one of 8 ways or more, and it'd be right. So you've got the situation where the majority of Matthew is also found in Mark, but there's 20% of the material that's unique to Matthew and 24% of the material that is shared in Matthew and Luke. So with Luke, 35% of it is unique to Luke. 41% is shared with all 3. Just a tiny sliver is shared only between Mark and Luke. And we know Luke admits it. Most scholars, and I agree, Luke came after Matthew and Mark. And Luke admits, he says, look, I wanted to get all these things together and make an orderly account of the life of Jesus. So he was admitting he's using these other sources to get it together. So we can take Luke out of the running for which one came first. The question is, which came first, Matthew or Mark? And the scholars say, and if you just look at this diagram, it seems to make sense superficially, that Mark came first, Matthew came along and borrowed a bunch of material from Mark. More than half of Matthew is borrowed from Mark. Then about 44% of Matthew was its own original material. And then Luke borrowed about half of it and put it in Luke and left 20% of the material unique to Matthew. So Luke borrowed from Matthew and Mark, and Matthew borrowed from Mark. That is the standard narrative, I would say, that the scholars are putting out there. But there's another narrative I want you to consider. There's another explanation for this same data that fits what the church fathers are saying. And a couple of things have to be understood here. For example, they think that when Matthew is quoting Jesus, he uses, and Jesus talking about the scriptures, they use the Septuagint version, but they also say when Matthew is quoting scriptures himself, he uses some other version. He uses, maybe he himself was personally translating a Hebrew text that he had into Greek. And a lot of the reason they say that is because they don't believe that the guys who wrote the Masoretic text later changed the text to try to take Christ out of it. The Masoretic text was written by rabbis who didn't believe in Jesus. And if the original verse said, the virgin shall bear a child, then they wouldn't, that points to Jesus too much. If the original Old Testament prophecy said that, so they tweaked it and used a word that just means the young woman shall bear a child, which hardly seems supernatural at all, does it? So there's some argument. The Septuagint says the virgin, and the Septuagint was written way before Jesus, and all the Greek Jews were using this virgin. It says the virgin shall bear a child. And then suddenly the Masoretic text, which came along after Jesus, after the rabbi, and written by rabbis who opposed him, somehow that got turned into the young woman shall bear a child. And you have to decide which of those the original text really said. And I think the younger text is a Septuagint. They didn't have problems saying the virgin shall bear a child. It makes more sense to say a virgin shall bear a child if you're talking about a supernatural act, because there's nothing spectacular about a young woman bearing a child. It's only become something worth mentioning as a sign if it's a virgin shall bear a child. And so that prophecy in the Old Testament was repurposed for Messiah, or really it was about Messiah originally, but they sort of also used it for a purpose in the day. And the Bible does that a lot. But I want to show you a scenario that makes sense why Matthew and Mark share so much material, and Mark did not come first, but Matthew came first in Hebrew. And here I'm going to start right here. We go. I think Matthew was written in Hebrew. There was a period of time in which the church translated portions of it and sort of trickled out in Hebrew, various translators, and that's called a targum. They did that when the Jews all started speaking Aramaic. They had these things called targums, which were, they would hire somebody to translate the Hebrew into Aramaic and then use that for their Bible lesson because they didn't understand Hebrew very well anymore. And the same thing can happen with a Matthew that was written in Hebrew or Aramaic, translated into Greek. The church could have had what amounted to targums, a practice of the day. But eventually, someone said, you know what, we need to do all of Matthew in Greek. Let's do all of Matthew. Let's have our own version of Matthew in Greek instead of getting piecemeal. Well, where did they get the Greek? As they read the stories of Matthew, they said, you know what, Mark doesn't have an ending. Mark doesn't have very much at the beginning about the teachings of Jesus, and Mark doesn't have anything at the end, really not much about after Jesus was resurrected and appeared to the disciples. Matthew does. We need that in Greek, the whole thing. And so they did it, but as they're translating, what did they find out? You know, this story is very much the same. In Hebrew, the Hebrew version that Matthew's writing sounds a lot like Mark. How do I translate this Hebrew into Greek? I've already got the translation right here. It's Mark. Mark has already written this thing in Greek. He's telling the same story that Matthew tells. Why do I reinvent the wheel here? Why do I want to retranslate this? I've already got the word from Mark, what it says. I will just take what Mark's already written and use it in Matthew, because Matthew is telling the same story in Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever dialect that was. Why do I have to come up with my original translation of Greek? I can just use that one. Let's see what this looks like on a diagram. All right, so here's what I think happened. The Hebrew Matthew did come first, and the churches got translations of snippets of that. You could call them targums of Matthew written in Greek. And that's why Matthew is used by the early church much more than Mark does. It fits the evidence. Whatever theory you come up with has to explain why Matthew is used so much more than Mark in the early church if Mark really came first. It didn't. It doesn't fit the facts. And they have a hard time working around that, but if they all agree to ignore it, I guess they can pretend it'll go away for a while. But the fact is, Matthew was used more by the early church than Mark. How were they getting it? I think it's because there was a Hebrew Matthew that existed, Hebrew or Aramaic, and that people were doing their own little translations of short sections of it, and they started passing those around and using them in church. So call them the Targums of Matthew. And this fits with a quote of Eusebius that we started out with. Remember when he said they each interpreted it as they were able? That's what's happening here. Different independent churches or different people translated segments of it and said, hey, here's my translation. Someone else said, hey, here's mine. And that's why the quotes attributed to Matthew tend to have more of a Septuagint type flavor to it. Yes, a Septuagint type flavor to it, a less Septuagint type flavor. It's almost like it's my own original translation of this Old Testament verse, because it was some independent agents translating Matthew from Hebrew to Greek. And so when it was time to make a whole Greek Matthew, here's what they had to work with. They had the Hebrew Matthew. They had a Mark, which had a lot of the same material on it. Not early in Jesus' life, not much there, not at the end of, or after the resurrection and his ministry of what happened afterwards, but in the Passion Week and in the trial and in the crucifixion. Mark had a lot of material and some teachings. And so what they did was they said, you know what, we can just, it wasn't cut and paste. They didn't have computers, but they didn't want to reinvent the wheel either. Mark had already said what happened here, and he used these words to say it. We're going to use the same words here. And then we have some more material that Mark didn't cover that's already translated for us in some of these targums. And so we'll use those targums. We can tell that this targum here is translating chapter 4 of Matthew, so we're going to use it for chapter 4 of Matthew. And they pasted those in too. And then they had to do a little on their own. And this explains all the facts. This speculation, it explains why church tradition says what it says. It explains the quote of Eusebius about each interpreted them as it was able. It explains why the early church quoted Matthew more than Mark. And it explains why Matthew looks like it does. It looks like you guys went straight from the Septuagint in some places, which is where you went straight from Mark. Other places, it looks like when Matthew is quoting the Old Testament, he's kind of freewheeling it a little bit. It doesn't all look exactly the same. Right, sometimes it was Matthew, or sometimes it was doing a direct translation of the Hebrew Matthew by the one guy who did the Greek Matthew, or sometimes the one guy who did the Greek Matthew was cutting and pasting from these targums that he had, which may have been translated by different people. So that explains why some parts look so uniform and others look a little patchier. Explains all the data. But what it means is that Matthew came first in Hebrew. It didn't come first in Greek, but they had pieces of it in Greek early on. Now, what the scholars have to do is say, well, there was some mysterious Q document, and that's where maybe we can explain these things with some mysterious Q document that was maybe a something that sounded kind of like Matthew, but it wasn't really Matthew, and they put Matthew together later. Guys, the Targums added together are the Q document. Hebrew Matthew, the Hebrew Matthew is the Q document. You don't need to speculate about another unattested to document. You can use the documents that the testimony of the people that were there say were there. They say there was a Hebrew Matthew there. They say that each interpreted them as best they were able. They're telling you that Targums were a thing back then. It was a practice that they did. They translated things from a language Scripture was in a language they couldn't understand. They would translate a passage into a language they could understand and pass that on. So it really is a superior way of looking at it. You know, you're defining. You don't have to come up with a mysterious Q document that nobody really talks about. It's superior in every way. Why haven't the scholars thought of it by now? Why does it have to be some redneck from Arkansas with a secular job and 3 kids and a YouTube channel? It's because they're all only looking at one side of the bet. They're only looking at the side of church tradition is wrong, and we've got to find a way to make Mark first because we're operating from a premise of unbelief. Stop operating from a premise of unbelief and open your mind to the possibility that God is in this, because he is. And I'm going to show that. I'm going to keep showing that. I'm going to keep giving better explanations than you have, even as I got a bachelor's degree in business. So what? It has nothing to do with Bible scholarship, but it doesn't have to. You just have to have have an open mind and an active mind willing to examine these questions. You guys could do it way better than me if you would. So that is my theory about where Matthew came from, why Matthew is the first gospel written, which aligns with all the evidence best. And they may be tempted to say, well, there was a core Matthew, but then they completely added Mark onto it, and that the core Matthew was just a bunch of teachings of Jesus. No, that doesn't explain the facts either. The fact is that Mark doesn't talk much about the early life of Jesus. You say, okay, well, that was just the oracles, though. It wasn't anything about the later part. No, doesn't fit the facts either, because you've got all this material. Mark doesn't cover the resurrection much. Remember, Matthew does. So it wasn't just the teachings of Jesus or some loose Q document that talks about the teaching of Jesus but no resurrection. Matthew talked about the resurrection extensively, and that made it in. All they used Mark for was to plug the gaps. And did Mark give more detail than Matthew did on some of those accounts? I don't know. Was it a verse-by-verse replacement? I don't know. That's why I say you scholars could do this better than me. You can study that out and find out. But it really doesn't matter, does it? Matthew and Mark were telling the same stories. Matthew's story was more complete. It was more filled out at the beginning. It was more filled out post-resurrection. And the church knew it. We should know it too. Thank you so much for listening, and may God bless you.